King of all days. Glory to you in the highest place.
A couple of things that I'd like to make you aware of before we get rolling on the lesson. There are 2 movies coming up, and I'll just go ahead and do a little commercial here. There's 2 movies coming up that look like they are going to be fantastic movies. And I don't know that I will get to go see them, because with my children's situation, if it doesn't have fairy princesses or singing animals, I'm not going to get to see it. However, these do look like fantastic opportunities. The first one, if it's going to work, is called Is Genesis History? And it's put out by an organization. The guy involved, Del Tackett, he's also involved in the Truth Project, which put out the material we used for the Does God Exist, and all that historical information that we have on our timeline back there about is the Bible reliable. He was instrumental in those studies, and so I'm sure it's probably going to be a pretty good resource here. But tomorrow, and they're doing one night only, so if you got nothing else to do tomorrow night, don't have any plans already, maybe you could go check this out. It's called Is Genesis History?
There are many questions about the history of the earth. What major events might have occurred to shape it? Was there a global flood? A Big Bang? How did the earth become filled with so many amazing and diverse creatures? I'm Del Tackett, the creator of the Truth Project, and I've spent a year asking a wide variety of scientists to help me better understand the world we see around us.
Well, it was a story that we all learned in grammar school. Colorado River, over tens of millions of years, cut the Grand Canyon. Most geologists have jettisoned that idea. You can't imagine a canyon enduring that long with erosion. Time is not a magic wand that solves all the geologic problems of the world.
The past is the key to the present. You want to understand why the way the world is today, you've got to understand what happened in the past.
You take the present processes and extend into the past, not unreasonable. But there's evidence in the rocks themselves that you can't do that.
If the fossils of dinosaurs have been dated incorrectly, then it's very likely the fossils of any organism have been dated incorrectly, and therefore then the geologic ages themselves are incorrect.
I believe in change over time, but I'm not an evolutionist. The shark has the ability to change, to adapt, to respond dynamically to the environment. But there are still sharks. And when we look at the fossil record, there are still sharks.
We've been told to look at a history of the earth that is millions and billions of years old. Is there evidence that it could have been created in only a matter of days?
You really need to begin by looking at the governing paradigm about the history of life and the history of the universe.
We've got 2 possibilities, and all the natural history museums in the country. I'll give you just one of those views.
Is there a recorded history that shows us a different view?
And when we look at the fossil record, we can see the complexity is all there from the beginning, and this begs the question of where did all this complexity come from?
An ancient history recorded in the book of Genesis.
You have this notion that there is providence that is then worked out across time in a linear, understandable, traceable fashion.
We'll come face to face with an earth-shattering question. Is Genesis history?
In the theater. I know the Jewel Theater in Woodway is going to have it, and there's a theater in Temple. I just briefly looked at the website. I didn't get actual detailed information. But that is tonight. If that's something you might be interested in. I know I'm definitely going to be looking to get the DVD whenever that comes out.
Well, good afternoon.
Hello. That'll definitely be a good resource And it's one of those things where, there are people even within the church who disagree on how Genesis should be understood, and they can still love Jesus and be saved, and we can disagree about that sort of thing, but it's just really good to look at the evidence and see, what does the science say? What does the scripture say? How does it go together? And it's just always a fun conversation to have, trying to understand God's word. The second one, this is coming out in April. If you're familiar with Lee Strobel, who wrote the Case for Christ, his story is that his wife got saved. He was an award-winning investigative journalist in Chicago. His wife ends up becoming a Christian, and he goes on a crusade to prove it wrong. He's going to save his wife from this fairy tale, superstition she's believing. And he comes out the other end discovering that it is true. And so they're actually making a movie about his story, named after the book he wrote called Case for Christ. And so this is coming out in April.
If somebody wanted to do an investigation into Christianity, where would you start?
If the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen, it's a house of cards.
You sure you want to give me that loaded gun?
I'm pretty sure you're not going to be able to pull the trigger.
I've spent my entire career as a journalist uncovering the truth, until the day my wife presented me with the biggest story of my life.
I'm not going to lose my wife and my kids to something that I can't even reason with.
And what happened next changed me forever.
How can we even talk about historical evidence for the resurrection?
The Gospels are filled with contradiction.
The empty tomb is based on evidence. And isn't evidence your trade?
We all bet our lives on something.
The question is, what's it going to be?
As much as I would like to help out a fellow skeptic, what you're proposing is impossible.
Could Jesus survive being spiked to the cross?
There is no evidence anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion.
Just because I write something down and I bury it in the dirt, that doesn't make it true.
But I felt it was something more real than anything I've ever felt in my life. I'm praying for you.
Do you really want to know the truth, or is your mind already made up?
Stop blaming me and the church and God, and do your job.
No one's ever proven if the shroud is the actual burial cloth of the Christ. But whenever someone looks in those eyes for the first time, suddenly becomes a real person.
So that looks like that's going to be good. I'm real excited with all the good Christian movies that have been coming out lately. I mean, if we're honest, Christian movies have a reputation of being, kind of cheesy, not all that great a quality. But lately, they've been making some good ones, and they just keep getting better and better. It's right on Highway 84, before you get to Highway 6. It's there on the right. You pass. It's you need. Yeah, now I think there's 3 in Waco. One of them's an older one that's now a $1 movie, maybe $2 movie now. But okay, well, so there's some just opportunities for things coming out, and maybe if nothing else, you're just looking for the DVD to come out, but just know they're out there. Just these good productions that are being made that are showing, hey, you know what? This whole Christianity thing, it's not for nothing. It's not a fairy tale. It's not make-believe. And so, okay. Getting to our focus tonight, we're talking about the attributes of God. We're talking about his characteristics. What is God like? So we talked about how he is eternal. Was one of the big things that we finished with last time. And God being eternal kind of has some other implications that we're going to get to. But tonight, we're going to focus on that God is spirit, that he is intelligent, and that he is spaceless and timeless, kind of what those mean. And I know that's kind of maybe a lot to try to cram into one, but they're all very interrelated, so it's kind of hard to try to do one without addressing the others. First off, God is spirit, right? He's not a person. I mean, he's not a physical person. He doesn't have a body. The Bible might use language that talks about, the eyes of the Lord roam to and fro, or things like that, where it uses what's called anthropomorphic. Anthro meaning man, so it's like man-like. It's kind of related to man. It's just something we can relate to. It's just a figure of speech. It's not actually saying that God has eyes or something like that. When it talks about the strong arm of the Lord, it doesn't mean that he has an arm. It's just a figure of speech. But God is spirit. That means he's immaterial. He is incorporeal, right? He has no physical substance. He is invisible. There's nothing about our physical senses that can interact with God unless he manifests something to show himself. Even in the Bible, whenever we see God manifest something, it's not really him. The burning bush, that wasn't God. He was manifesting something from which he spoke to Moses. The Israelites in the wilderness, they had the pillar of, the cloud of smoke and the pillar of fire. Well, that wasn't actually God in the form of a fire or smoke. It was a representation manifested to show them. A couple of places where we kind of get this from. John 4:24 says that God is spirit. Right? This is Jesus talking to the woman at the well, I believe. Where he says, God is spirit, and those who worship him will have to worship in spirit and truth. And so then we have his omnipresence. Okay, if God is going to be everywhere, he can't be physical. We'll get into the omnipresence more specifically and detailed later in a different lesson. But if God is present everywhere, he can't be physical, right? He has to be some other thing, spiritual. He's part of that spiritual realm of life. 1 Timothy 6:16 talks about him being inaccessible to the five senses. It says, "Who alone has immortality and dwells in unapproachable light, whom no one has ever seen or can see. To him be honor and eternal dominion." So they're talking about how we can't perceive him with our physical senses. And the Bible says that we are prohibited from making images of God. Right? That's one of the big ones right there in the Ten Commandments. It says, "You shall not make for yourself a graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them." Because to do so, to make an image, try to make an image of God and say, here, this thing we will worship and call it God, it will misrepresent God. There's no way that a physical image is going to be able to accurately show us, represent to us who God is. So any image we make of God will necessarily be less than and inferior. And so if we're looking to an inferior image, if we're looking to a misrepresentation, then we're not worshiping God for who he is. And Deuteronomy 4, it says, "Since you saw no form on the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire, beware lest you act corruptly by making a graven image for yourselves in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female." So again, it's just replying, hey, whenever God showed up to you, you didn't see a form. You don't know what God looks like. Don't try to make some shape and say that this is God, because you don't know. And that would be corrupt to do so. And so the problem with trying to make an image of God is because we don't know what he looks like, because he's spirit. He cannot be perceived by our physical senses. Kind of the way that philosophers will describe this, theologians will describe it, is to say that God is pure mind without a body. And so in the same way that we are a soul, a mind, and a body, God is just pure mind. He has no body. And so that kind of has some implications. If he's pure mind, he's going to be intelligent. So one of the characteristics of God is that he has intelligence. And when we talk about human intelligence, it's a slightly different thing than when we talk about God having intelligence. Okay? We have intelligence because we process information that comes to us. We have our physical senses, we learn things, we perceive things. God doesn't work that way. God knows everything, just he knows it right off. His intellect is more powerful than ours. He doesn't have senses. He has direct access to all of creation. Okay? He doesn't have to go figure something out. He immediately knows what's going on. He doesn't have to go kind of test the waters and see how something works. He automatically knows his relationship with creation. There's some verses there. I didn't put the full text in, but you can go back and check those out. Bible says that he simply knows. Genesis 18, Exodus chapter 3, and that he knows perfectly. Acts chapter 16. And that God remembers, which is really just saying that he kind of classifies that he knows things that happened in the past. That there's no deficiency in his memory. He's not remembering things the way we remember things. He just has the knowledge that something had happened. And God is rational and orderly. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 40, talks about that, which is a really big motivator for science. We talked about that some whenever we were looking at the evidence of does God exist? That because of God's intellect, because he is rational and orderly, the early pioneers of science, they said, hey, wait a minute. The creator of the universe is rational, intelligent, and orderly. Well, his creation should reflect his attributes of being rational and orderly. So we should expect an orderly universe, which means we can study it. And then it was actually Christians born out of a love for God and his intelligence that were the early pioneers of modern science. And so there's a few kind of things that follow regarding God's intelligence. Since he is a personal being, he is intelligent. Right? Because he's not just a force, he's personal, so he has some mental interaction that goes on. He thinks about things. It's part of what it means to be personal. And so because he is personal, he necessarily is intelligent. Because he is infinite, he is necessarily infinitely intelligent. Right? Any attribute that God has, he has infinitely. So when we say God is love, that means his love is infinite. God has knowledge. That means his knowledge is infinite. His intelligence, then, is infinite. And an infinite whole must have infinite parts. That's kind of why this works. If God is an infinite being, everything that we would say about him, every characteristic he would have, he has infinitely, which would include his intelligence. Since God is intelligent in all of his being, everything he does is intelligent. He don't make mistakes. He don't do stupid stuff. Right? The Bible says that the foolishness of God is greater than the wisdom of man because his intelligence is perfect. Since the nature of God is unity, when God's intelligence conceives a plan, he has both the ability to show it and the ability to carry it out. So, like on Sunday nights, whenever we've been looking in Isaiah, and Dr. Krause is teaching some of the prophecies and things in there, and it says, Isaiah gives a prophecy. This will come to pass. He can say it. He can describe it. He can tell you what's going to happen, and then he has the ability to carry it out. That's wrapped up in his intelligence. Excuse me. Since God is unchanging, his creation is therefore intelligibly designed and reflects regularity and uniform laws. Again, that goes back to science. Why does science work? Because God is intelligent. Because of his intelligence, his creation is going to be intelligible. You can understand it and figure it out. There's this idea that the creation reflects the creator. Right? If you make something, your personality kind of goes into what you make. This is one of the reasons why if kids start drawing pictures of death, we get worried, right? Because the art reflects something about the artist. In the same way, creation reflects the creator. And he's intelligent, so therefore his creation is going to be intelligible. Next, any questions about God's intelligence or his being spirit? Before I just kind of steamroll you through all that. At any chance, you can just throw something at me or whatever, get my attention.
Never quite wrapped myself around that, things like when he sits on his throne and we bow down, what's he going to be there?
Yeah.
Something has to be there for us to see, or like Moses saw his back parts and stuff like that when he walked by him.
And that's one of the things where we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, and the things it uses like that to describe it really kind of fall short of what the reality is going to be, because our minds probably can't even conceive of what God is like.
Moses, you can't see my front parts, but I'll let you see my back parts there.
Yeah, he says, I'm going to hide you in the rock, and I'll kind of cover you over with my hand, and I'll let you catch a glimpse of my backside while I walk by. Even then, God isn't physical. He wasn't, like a giant walking by with a hand over the rock. And so whatever it was that Moses saw wasn't, technically God's backside. It was, we don't know what he saw. And we don't know whenever we're standing there in heaven, is it just going to be, like sometimes they'll show in the movies where it's just this glowing, just light presence of, whatever. I don't know. We don't know. We do know that the Bible says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So maybe once we get to heaven, we'll never actually interact with the Father. Maybe it would be Jesus, because he's physical. He's a body, and so we'll be able to talk with him. But don't know. I mean, that's one of those things that theologians and philosophers wrestle over and argue about, have for centuries, and probably will continue to do so.
Well, he had a body when he came to this earth.
Well, but he resurrected. He had his resurrected body, and he ascended. There's nothing to indicate that he no longer has a body. He was a man just like us, and just as we will have bodies, he has a body. And so, Jesus has a resurrected body in heaven. Next, God is spaceless. That means that he has no volume, he has no mass. He doesn't take up space. Space is an area where physical reality exists, and since God is not physical, he doesn't take up any space. If you remember, we talked about whenever the universe began, there's this relationship between matter, space, and time, which means that whatever created the universe can't be part of the universe. So therefore, it's not made of matter, space, or time. So this is kind of that same thing. God is not matter. He's immaterial. He's spirit. In the same way, he has no space. He doesn't take up any space. The old joke or philosophical quandary: how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? As many as want to, because they don't take up space. They're spirit. Like God is spirit. They're spirit. They don't take up space. And so he is spaceless. You can't actually put a quantity of where God is. He's over here. He's, just taking up that space. He's over in that room. No, he doesn't take up space. Now the big one, and this is the one that I wrestled with. God is timeless. Okay? This is the one that's really related to his being eternal. The Bible describes him as being without beginning and without end. And there are several verses throughout the Bible that talk about his kind of perception of or relationship with time. But nothing is ever really clear. We know that he's eternal. We know that he doesn't care about or worry about the time the way we do. In Psalm 102, it says, "You, O Lord, shall endure forever. I said, O my God, do not take me away in the midst of my days. Your years are throughout all the generations. Of old you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will endure. Yes, they will all grow old like a garment, like a cloak. You will change them, and they will be changed, but you are the same, and your years have no end. And so, creation may come and go, but God's forever, right? So how does that work, right? Psalm 93, verse 2 says, your throne is established from old, you are from everlasting. So we exist in time, and we kind of go, day after day after day, moment after moment, and we live and then we die, but God doesn't have that. And so what is God's relationship to time? The Bible does not clearly say. It says he's eternal. We know he knows the future. The Bible says he knows the beginning from the end. There are prophecies that come to be fulfilled centuries, maybe thousands of years later. So we know that he has some knowledge, that he has knowledge of the future. We know that there were things that he said were in place before creation ever began. Jesus is the lamb slain before the foundation of the earth. So before he ever said, let there be light, he knew Jesus was going to the cross. And so how does that all work out with his relationship with time? The fact is, we don't know. Yeah, that is... yeah. Yeah, or is it going to cease to be, or is it just going to continue on forever? Right? Yeah. And there are. The problem is, and here's the trouble I ran into, and it's been racking my brains all day. The material that I'm mostly using, as kind of the backbone for this study, spends about 3 paragraphs on this issue. That this issue is so far more complicated than 3 paragraphs worth. And so it's like, okay, well, I'm going to supplement with a little bit. And it's one of those things where you pull a thread and it just keeps coming unraveled. And so the more I dug and I dug and I dug, I was like, wow, we could do a whole series on this for a month or 2 and not even exhaust the material about God and time. There are, like I said, all we know for sure from the scriptures, God is eternal. He existed before creation, and he will exist forever into the future. That he knows what's going on at different points in time. And okay, so how does that work? We're not told how it works. Philosophers have been trying to figure it out. And there's different ideas. There's some people that say, well, God is what's called temporal. He experiences time. That he, experiences day after day after day, just like we do, only he's eternal. He had infinite days in the past, and he'll have infinite days in the future, but he experiences time the same way we do. There's some who say that God is outside of time. The classical understanding of God being timeless is that he's in a whole different dimension. He's got nothing to do with our time. He can kind of see it all laid out before him, and he knows what's going on, but he knows the beginning from the end, and he's kind of present in every bit of time. Like if you imagined the whole timeline of history was just like on a table laid out before us, that would be God's perception, that he can see the whole thing laid out before him, and so that he would be outside of time. And there's some people who say he's omnitemporal. He's in all times at the same time. So there is no future, there is no past. For him, all of it is just the present. And I mean, there's some other views. So some people say that he used to be timeless, but as soon as he created, he became like he stepped into time. And so now he experiences time in the same fashion we do, day after day, moment after moment. There is no shortage of theories that philosophers have. And the problem is they all have liabilities. They all kind of make you go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, but what about? There's none of them that answer all the questions perfectly. But what we do know is that God is contrasted with our experience. He doesn't experience time the way we do. That we are only know kind of what's here with us at this moment. But he knows the past, he knows the future, as well as he knows the present. In Psalm 90, verse 4, it says, 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, like a watch in the night. So to God, 1,000 years, nothing. Just gone. You know, I mean, it may as well have been, just the time since lunch. No big deal.
That's where the Christian Science get their doctrine that nothing is real. We don't actually exist. It's just, mental stuff for us.
I'm not sure, because some of what they believe sounds like almost like New Age, little Eastern mysticism, pantheism. That we're all part of the mind of God and we're all part of God. This world is just illusion kind of stuff. But yeah.
I know they believe that this is not real. I mean, I'm not actually sitting here.
Yeah.
I don't actually exist. It's all in my mind.
Yeah. I've never really dug too much into Christian Science belief, so I'm not sure. Couldn't answer that.
That's why they don't have doctors and things, because you can't actually be sick because you're not actually here.
Yeah. Right. I mean, what's the point of healing a body that's not even real? Excuse me. God's perspective on time is different than ours. In 2 Peter chapter 3, he's kind of reminding the people who are kind of freaking out at that point. Right? 2 Peter is written to a church undergoing persecution. And this is decades later, and they're sitting there thinking, hello, where's Jesus? Thought he was coming back. And so Peter's words to them is, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So his perspective on time is different than ours. He's got his plan. He's got his purpose. It's going to happen when it needs to happen. He's not concerned about meeting a schedule, right? Whereas we, in our just time experience that we're in, we're thinking, when, God, when? And so we get anxious, but he doesn't have that. He sees the big picture beginning from the end. He knows the whole enchilada. And because of our finite minds, we can only grasp the concept of God's timeless existence in part. And in so doing, we describe him as a God without a beginning, without an end, eternal, infinite, everlasting, etc. But all of these words kind of just don't quite get us there to fully understanding it. And so, yeah. Any questions on any of that? We probably could ask tons of them. But so what is time? Oddly enough, scientists will tell us that time is actually part of the feature of the universe. They actually refer to the universe as space-time. That our universe exists in 4 dimensions. You have height and width and depth, and time is another dimension to it. So our physical senses, we know height and width and depth, right? But then there's time, and we can't really picture how that works. But mathematically, they work it out as there being 4 dimensions. We know that time can actually slow down or speed up based on physical conditions. Gravity alters the speed of time. Right now, the satellites that are orbiting the Earth that we use for GPS, if you ever do a GPS and it's telling you to go here and drive there and turn there, they actually have part of the program to adjust for the time difference, because closer to the gravity of the Earth, our clocks run slower. And the clocks up there in space orbiting the Earth are running faster. So you can take 2 clocks, set them at the exact same time, shoot one into space, let it fly around for a while, come back down. They're going to be at 2 different times. So gravity will actually affect time. So time is part of creation, actually part of the physical world somehow. And so time is also basically just change. It's the way we mark change. It is just a benchmark of how we notice something is different than it was before. And when you think about it, God doesn't change. So how can you be said to, how is he doing time whenever he doesn't change? And if time is a function of the material world and God's not material, then how would time apply to him? So those are just kind of some things that philosophers try to wrestle through and think their way through. All right. One thing, though, that we can all know is that as believers, we have this sense of comfort in knowing that whatever stress, whatever anxiety, whatever problems we may be encountering because of this time that we're living in, that God transcends that time. And however the details of it work out, we can take comfort in knowing that God is above it. That we serve a God who stands over this experience of our life and sees the beginning from the end. And we can take comfort in that. Any questions on anything else about time? I'm probably not the person to try and answer them. This is one of those, like I said, I wasn't entirely satisfied with the material that I was looking at. And as I started to pull that thread, it just unraveled. And I thought, wow, okay. One guy that I was listening to a little talk he gave, he spent like 13 years studying the relationship between God and time. That was just his main focus of study for over a decade. And here I'm trying to cover it in 10 minutes. So, but any other thoughts or questions on God's timelessness? Just a couple of common challenges. In my searching and looking for just some more information, I came across some challenges that skeptics would give on some of these issues. First off, they would say, how can a timeless God choose to create? Right? Because time marks change. If God doesn't change, so if he's existing for eternity in the past, or we wouldn't really call it past because there's no time until he created. And so if he's just existing, how does he choose to create? Because that would have to mean that one moment he's not creating, the next moment he is creating. But how is there a moment? There's no time. He's timeless. And so they would say, how does that work? That makes no sense. The way philosophers kind of will address this is they say that there wasn't a prior moment, that his creation, his choice to create and the actual act of creation happen simultaneously. That you don't actually have to have a cause and effect in time. They can both happen at the same time. So whenever God said, I'm going to create, boom, time began. And so at the same moment, he chose to create, which wouldn't really be a moment. See, we can't even think in those terms, but some think that maybe even God existed in kind of his own time. Maybe you've heard that where it's like God has his own timeline, and he created, and we have our timeline, and he just exists in this hyper time or meta time, this time that exists above ours that's distinct and different from our timeline. So he did have time, he did have moments, but as far as our experience is concerned, he's timeless. That's the way some would answer that. But that, again, is not without its problems also. Another challenge that I read that I came across was they'll say, how can an immaterial God, right, because God is spirit, he's not physical, so how does an immaterial God interact with a physical world? I mean, because you could say, okay, he creates the world. We get that. Boom, he created it. There it is. But he is not physical, so how does he interact with it? And we know he interacts with it. I mean, you read through the Bible. He's parting seas. He's stopping rivers. He's healing sick. He's raising dead, right? So he's definitely interacting with the physical world. And people say, well, how? By what mechanism does a non-physical being interact with a physical reality? Which, of course, kind of is what's called begging the question. They're assuming there's going to be a material physical cause that they can point to and study like science. But we're not talking about a physical being. The real fact is we don't know. We don't know what exactly it is that God manipulates some energies or whatever. And I've read one guy was talking about quantum mechanics, and that my eyes just glazed over. I don't know much about that. But excuse me. One thing we do know, we have another thing that's immaterial that interacts with the material world. Our own minds. Our mind is not a physical thing. Our thoughts are not our brain. Materialists, atheists, I like to say that our thoughts and our mind and our thinking is our brain, But logically, that's not possible. They are logically two different things. Our mind is something immaterial that affects our physical being. So if I want to lift my arm, there wasn't some kind of mechanical process by which I made my arm lift. I just thought, lift my arm, and it goes up. In the same way, if God wills something to happen in nature, it just happens. Just like whenever I just think, speak these words, and they come out. If God wills for something to happen in creation, it happens in that same way. Now, what is the exact mechanism that makes that immaterial-material interaction? We don't know. Doesn't mean it's not there. Doesn't mean it's not happening. But the skeptic world in which we live in, they want something physical. They want something concrete that they can point at and test with science. And if that's not there, then it's not real. Well, that's just their view, and they can welcome to it if they want it. But I choose to live in reality where my immaterial mind affects my material body all day long. And so, any other thoughts or questions on any of that? I know some of the stuff we've had tonight, where they get a little deeper than the just kind of surface that I'm wanting to cover. But
I've got some thoughts and questions, but I don't think I'll live long enough.
These are things that philosophers and theologians have been wrestling with for centuries and arguing about for centuries. I mean, very, very intelligent people disagree about some of this stuff and have very rational reasons why they disagree. And so it's the kind of thing where you can sit down, you could go to YouTube and just like type in, God and time. You listen to one philosopher explain something, you go, oh, hey, that makes sense. And you listen to this other philosopher explain the opposite and go, oh yeah, that makes sense. And so which one of them's right? Oh, well, you know what? The Bible doesn't specifically tell us. But it's maybe one of those things that we just understand the best we can, and that's where faith steps in.
The wisdom of man is the foolishness of God.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. So, all right. Well, next week, I believe we get into the omni attributes, being all-powerful, his omnipotence and his omniscience and his omnipresence. And how does that work? And so, let's go ahead and pray.
We're unashamed to say, Lord, we give our hearts to you, so we might bring you praise, and we offer up our lives, because you caught our gaze.